Chapter 3. The story is told by Mary, a particular kind of laugh. I had been with my sister Abigail all day, sitting under the big old oak tree in the middle of Nazareth. It was fun sitting there, even if we were doing chores. Wool spinning was less boring in the middle of the village. We used to watch the boys, who were studying at the synagogue, playing soldiers during their breaks between lessons with branches for swords, or the flocks of goats that herdsmen would bring through. I could never tell how they knew whose animals were whose, because every single one was brown with white spots. The goats strutted and bleated their way through the village, and we had to stuff our work under our skirts to keep them from the clouds of dust billowing beneath their hoofs. That day, Yakin had managed to get loose, Joanna's donkey. He burst down the street with a triumphant hee-haw and bucked exactly like the boys from the synagogue, celebrating when they landed a good sword strike. Eventually he came over to rest in the shade, and Abigail stroked his face while I grabbed hold of the rope around his neck. He drooped his muzzle to the ground as I led him back down the street to Joanna. "Oh, Mary, thank you," she shouted over the sound of her husband's trundling pottery wheel. "Here, I've just been baking. Are you hungry?" The loaf she gave me was quite small, but it was still nice of her. I took it back to Abigail and we munched away. But Nathan, my little brother, had just come out of the synagogue and he barreled up to us. "Can I have some?" He tried to snatch the loaf from Abigail's hands. "Stop!" I cried, but it was too late. She pushed him away, and now they were both sprawling on the ground, along with most of Abigail's wool. "Nathan!" I said angrily, starting to pick it up. Then I dropped it all again. Abigail had started choking. She must have been halfway through a mouthful and it had got stuck in her throat. Her face was going pinker and pinker, her hands fluttering helplessly in the air. I slapped her on the back. She gave one big huge cough and began to take big shuddering gulps, chest heaving. Her eyes were big and white and panicked. Tears flowed down her face, but she was breathing. Nathan had picked himself up and mooched away. Back to his lessons. I put my arm around Abigail's shoulders, relieved that she was all right. "Cheer up. Look, I'll tell you why our ancestors Abraham and Sarah named their son Isaac, which means laugh. But," I poked at her, "only if you smile." It worked. The grin started to compete with the tears on her face, so we settled ourselves back down, and I began. Later I thought it was funny that I told this particular story on that particular day. I had been thinking about Sarah and Abraham already, of course, because of the gossip Joseph had heard. But telling the story properly to my sister made me think about it more, and it helped me make sense of things afterwards. "There are different kinds of laughter," I told Abigail. "Happy laughter, silly laughter, mean laughter, and laughter you just can't help, like when someone tickles you." But none of these was the kind of laugh which our ancestor Sarah laughed when she heard she was going to have a son. Abby nestled into me as she always did when I was telling a story. The tears had gone now. I spoke low so that only she could hear. Our ancestors didn't live like we live now, in houses made of brick and stone, I said. Abraham and Sarah lived in a big tent, which they took with them from place to place. One day they had pitched the tent in Mamre, far away on the other side of Jerusalem. There were huge old oak trees there, and you could sit beneath their shade. My sister looked up at our own tree. I could see what was in her imagination, Abraham and Sarah sitting with us beneath the twisting branches, patting a donkey while their tent flaps flapped in the breeze. Sarah and Abraham were very old, I went on. They had wanted a child of their own for a very long time. And God had promised them a son, but the promise had never come true. And now Sarah believed it never would. Then one day 3 visitors came. The Lord? The Lord? Interrupted Abigail. I must have told her the story before sometime, I realized. Yes. We are told that it was the Lord God himself who was their visitor. Abraham didn't know this at first. Even so, he welcomed these strange figures kindly. He gave them food, Abby offered, milk and meat and cheese curds. I agreed, and Sarah kneaded dough and baked bread to soak up the milk and the meat juices. But she stayed inside the tent while Abraham took the food out to the guests. Why? I don't know, I admitted. Maybe she was tired from all that kneading. Maybe she was shy. Maybe she thought they would not want her there. But she sat behind the tent flap and listened to everything the men said. To do the Lord's voice, I tried to sound deep and booming. The Lord God said, "Your wife Sarah will have a son soon." And behind the tent flap, Sarah said to herself, "A son when I'm old?" She couldn't help but scoff at that. She burst out laughing. It wasn't really a happy laugh. It was not a mean laugh. It was... I couldn't find the right word. Angry? Yes, I replied slowly, or maybe bitter or sour. She knew it was impossible that she could have a child now. Why would God promise such a thing? Anyway, the Lord God heard her laughing, of course, and he said again, I put on that booming voice, "Your wife Sarah will soon have a son." Then the 3 figures got up and went away. After that, Abraham and Sarah took down their tent and left the shady oaks of Mamre. They went through the desert where the sand howled in their faces. They had adventures and escaped danger. And 1 year after they had met with the Lord, Sarah gave birth to a son. Abigail wiggled happily. Isaac! When the child was born, I nodded. They named him Isaac, which means laugh, because they were so happy to have a son. Every time they looked at his chubby little face, they smiled and laughed. God had kept his promise. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and everyone who hears about it will laugh too. Ho, 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 went Abigail obligingly, the sight of her holding her sides like a jolly old man pretending to laugh made me burst out in genuine laughter, and soon we were both wiping away tears. And I concluded my story. Isaac grew up and had sons of his own, and they had sons, and eventually there was a whole nation, a great people that still exists today, even though it's a bit scattered and divided. And you and I are part of that people, the children of Abraham. As I spoke, the boys ran out of the synagogue again for the end of the day. Time to go home, I said, swinging my wool baskets onto my back and catching Nathan to make him carry Abby's. It was a punishment for earlier, but both of them seemed to have forgotten what had happened. They were soon racing ahead of me, and I decided not to chase them. I was imagining my grandaunt Aunt Elizabeth, laughing. I could just picture the worry lines on her face fading away. By the time we reached the almond field, Nathan and Abigail had disappeared into the house, and all was peaceful. The tree branches rustled, and I paused, looking up into their shade, wondering whether God really was going to give my great aunt and uncle a child. But the peace soon shattered. My mother, of all people, she ran towards me, actually ran, and I saw a letter rolled up in her hand. Mary! Mary, she panted. Mary, it's true. What? I cried, able to think of only one thing. Elizabeth? Elizabeth, she nodded. Yes, my Aunt Elizabeth is actually pregnant at last.